Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is our second session. I did not answer one question last time that I delayed, and I feel that we should answer it and get it out of the way, and that is dealing with the question of, is abortion genocide? I'm going to be brief on this because we could spend an entire session on the question of abortion in Judaism. Let me be brief by essentially showing you a biblical verse which for the Jews is decisive and terribly important. And because of that, it has a great significance. And then talking about the theological issue for about 3 minutes, and then touching on the issue of, is abortion genocide? I'm going to share my screen, so I want you to read essentially the biblical verses. This is Exodus 21:22, and the Hebrew is of Chianutzlan Hashim v'nagfui shaharav yatzu yaladav v'lo yason enosh yanesh kasher yashit alav bal ha'ish shavinatan plilim v'mason yev v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh kviya tachat kviya petza tachat patza chavura tachat chavura. When two or more parties fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband's, may exact the payment to be based on a reckoning. But if the other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This, by almost all Jewish authorities, is cited as the biblical proof text that abortion itself is not murder, and that the fetus does not have the status in the womb of a living child, because if the fetus had the status of a living child, it would be a life for a life, etc., an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The difference theologically between Jews and some Christians has to deal with a very simple principle, which is that the status of the fetus in Jewish tradition, and this is developed very strongly in the Talmud, the status of the fetus in Jewish tradition is the status of a parasite who is existing on the benevolence and on the life of the mother. That also, ironically, is technically a biological status of the fetus, because if there's enough food for one but not for two, the fetus eats before the mother, and the mother would indeed starve. In Christianity, you have a different principle, which is the fetus is innocent life, untouched by original sin, and consequently, if you face the choice between original life, between untainted life and life that once it goes through the womb is tainted by original sin, the life of the fetus is the pure life. The life of the woman is touched by original sin, and consequently, the life of the fetus must take priority. That is not the case in Judaism. Until the baby leaves the womb, the baby is a parasite, and the host to the fetus is a parasite and a host to the mother, and consequently, abortion is not regarded as murder. There are differences as to when and when it is not permissible, but if you have a choice between the life of the mother and the life of the fetus, there is no question in Jewish law that the life of the mother takes priority. There is also no question in Roman Catholic tradition that the life of the fetus would take priority. That is the major difference between traditions, And that's why the personhood law is theologically objectionable to Judaism and halakhically objectionable to Judaism, because a fetus is not yet a person. Only a child who leaves the womb is considered a person. And even the rituals for mourning a fetus are different. A fetus there's no Shiva, there is no Kaddish. And in fact, we have only in the 20th and 21st century created rituals to observe this type of loss, because in our society, in ancient society, or even going back 100 years, parents had many miscarriages and many losses, and consequently their investment in the fetus and in the child was their investment in the fetus and in the child was not emotionally as significant. And now we find that there is a great emotional investment in the fetus and in the newborn child, and consequently rituals are required to deal with that catastrophe. Let me state, as a matter of genocide, what the major objection would be. The major objection with regard to genocide would be that the state is not committing genocide. This could be considered, if you considered the fetus a person, then it could be considered homicide, but not genocide, meaning that the decision to abort, if the fetus is indeed a person, the decision to abort is a homicide. It is not a genocide. It is not the targeting by the state or the targeting by another group. It is a decision that is made. It is a decision that is made with regard to individuals and not with regard to the society in general. I've been asked a second question: is it true in this that the Islam law is closer to Jewish law than the Christian law? The answer is yes, but I am not an authority. I am not an authority on Islamic law, so I would not want to deign an opinion. Let me suggest something that I will find out by next week and have something responsible to tell you. That reminds me of something that I used to experience when I taught at the Naval Academy. When I taught at the Naval Academy, if you called on a midshipman or woman for an answer, and they would say, "Do not know, sir, but we'll find out, sir." And that is, they were not allowed to fake an answer, but they also were not allowed, an officer could not be satisfied with ignorance, and therefore next time you had to call upon them, and they had to find out and answer the question. I'm asked, is abortion funded by the state a genocide? It depends again on how you view the status of the fetus and whether you accept the definition of Roman Catholic law with regard to the status of the fetus. Then you would say the state is sponsoring or is funding or permitting, but not necessarily committing genocide. Let's accept that for a moment as responding to it and get on for the agenda for this class. I want to take you now through something that will help us enormously along the way, help us enormously with the history of every genocide, and that is a relatively a couple of decades old, a relatively new concept of the different stages of genocide, offered first to the State Department by a Professor Gregory Stanton, and has become very much part of the discussion because it isolates the different stages of genocide. And it was originally the 8 stages of genocide. It is now called the 10 stages of genocide. And we'll see that whether it's 8 or 10, it articulates a process that we should be able to grapple with and understand. So let's look at that, and we will begin to understand the 10 stages of genocide. I hope everybody can see my screen, and we'll go with this. Whoops. Let me get up. And the first stage of genocide by Stanton is classification. All cultures have categories to distinguish people between us and them by ethnicity, race, religion, nationality, German or Jew, Hutu or Tutsi, American or non-American. If societies are too segregated, they're divided and likely to have, and most divided, they're more like, I would not say most likely, more likely to have a genocide. The main way of preventing genocide at this early stage is to develop opportunity in a society for people to work and live together who are from different ethnic, social, national, or religious backgrounds. This will allow people to become more tolerant and understanding of each other. In the United States, public schools serve this function as they are places where all young people can go regardless of their ethnic, social, national, or religious backgrounds. The search for common ground is vital to the early prevention of genocide. We could add to that a couple of elements could also be there. If you begin to say we are all children of God, which is a very elemental concept of what unifies, then classification melts away in a certain way because there's an underlying acceptance of everybody. If we say, as the American Declaration of Independence should have said and would now be understood to have said, that all men, meaning all people, are created equal, that gives us an underlying unity that is absolutely important. And classification is not a division classification. When you begin to say, for example, us and them, Jews and Gentiles, Americans and Americans and the rest of the world, black and white, privileged and underclass, men / women. In that way, the classification becomes a way of separation and classification of people into us and them. And even though there are us and them is sometimes very useful, people who are on my team, etc. But we also witnessed something interesting about the Olympics, which is that multiple people of multiple colors, of multiple backgrounds, of multiple ethnicities competed against each other peacefully. And consequently, even though there was classification, and classification became a matter of what country you were representing and the like, the common ground of competition, the common ground of the love of the game, the common ground of the elemental unity became one of the very important elements that made classification not a disuniting element, but just a fundamental and non-alienating part of reality. In Germany, remember, the ultimate classification became German and Jew, or really we would say Aryan and Jew. And you even had that echoed in a very interesting way in Poland, where you would say in Poland, as part of the common parlance, would be Poles and Jews. And in that sense, there would be, if we said the same thing in the United States of Americans and Jews, we would all be deeply and profoundly insulted, because the first claim that would be made would be what? That we Jews are also Americans, or are Americans, like every other American, and that classification would not work. So you have to classify is one of the elements, but let's again be clear. Classification is essential and indispensable and a part of genocide. It need not go there. It should not go there. And the question becomes whether there is an underlying unity that is deeper than the classification and the separation that is entailed with classification. I hope that this is clear as we go to the next stage. Symbolization. And again, symbolization, let's look at it in the Holocaust. Symbolization was clear in the Holocaust when somebody put on the Jewish star. If you were put on the Jewish star at that point, it was a symbol that you were to be discriminated against, that you had less protection, that you were other, that you were segregated, that you were separated, and the like. Now, not all Jewish stars represent that, because one of the incredible things that we see, and one of the magnificent things that we see, is that young people and older people put on Jewish stars as a matter of identification, showing who they are and what they are, and all that that represents. The kippah, the yarmulke, is again a symbolization. For the religious Jew, this is a symbol that we live in a world in which God is above, and we have responsibility. But to others, it could symbolize that you're a Jew and therefore subject to attack. And one of the questions becomes how comfortable you feel with the symbolization. And one of the elements of freedom is the capacity to walk around unhindered, untouched, and unvictimized when you are wearing the symbols of your separateness or your distinction. So one of the things that students complained on the college campus is if they were wearing a yarmulke, they were subject to increased discrimination and harassment, because they were then regarded as what? Responsible for what was happening in the Middle East. Let's look at symbolization in the terms that Stanton gives. We give names or other symbols to the classification of ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. We name people Jews or gypsies, or distinguish them by colors or dress, and apply to them members of the group. Classification and symbolization are universally human, do not necessarily result in genocide, unless they lead to the stage of dehumanization, namely somebody who wears some symbol, therefore becomes less than you are, less than one is. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of minority groups: the yellow star for Jews under Nazi rule, the blue scarf for people from the Eastern Zone and the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia. Or even in Cambodia, you had the idea that glasses were a symbol that meant that you were ethnic, you were essentially not a worker, but you were urban, and therefore you were subject to discrimination. Sometimes we impose symbols on ourselves. Gangs use certain colors. That's a group's right. Sometimes it backfires when they're discriminated against. Look, we all use symbolization. We use symbolization when we put on uniforms in a competition. I grew up in a home where I grew up in a home that rooted for the Brooklyn Dodgers, the original Dodgers, the authentic Dodgers, the up until the horror of O'Malley taking them to Los Angeles, the real Dodgers. And the next word that we used with regard to the Yankees was the hated Yankees. So that was, but that didn't mean that we were going to rape, murder, maim, kill, etc. the Yankees. And sometimes again, but the idea becomes that symbolization becomes a terribly important thing. It can be imposed. To combat symbolization, hate symbols can be legally forbidden. Swastikas, as can hate speech. I'm not sure I would agree with Stanton on this. Group markings like gang colors or tribal scarring can be outlawed, as well as the problem is that legal restrictions will fail if unsupported by society. Sometimes if we outlaw certain names, but hate exists, new names will take their place. It is widely supported, however, denial of symbolization can be powerful, as it were in Bulgaria, when many non-Jews chose to wear the yellow star, depriving it of its importance as Nazi symbols for Jews. According to legend, in Denmark, the Nazis did introduce. According to legend, the Nazis did not introduce the yellow star in Denmark. This because they knew the king would not wear it, even though because they knew even the king would wear it, and that is they had a sense of communal solidarity. The legend is that the king did wear the yellow star that represented, as it were, the commitment of the Danes to regard Jews as fellow citizens, which made more sense than the division between, or was more essential than the division between Jew and Gentile in Denmark. But let's look also at symbolization, and that is that sometimes you attack by using symbols, sometimes you attack by using words. We in American society have now determined that at least non-blacks will never use the N word. They will never even state the N word. And consequently, the making the word taboo is a way of, again, restricting the possibility of name calling. I'm going to take 1 second just to look at the questions to make sure that I have gotten and responded. Okay, Bobby Meth says, since 50% kids are raised without any religion, children of God is meaningless. Does that make woke ideology even more problematic? In 2024, the Olympics were rife with classification issues as Muslims refused to shake hands in competition with Israelis, and transgenders women were bullied and demeaned. Case of Tibet, forced sterilization and abortion does not fall into articles of genocide. Actually, let's answer Jackie's question very simply. It does come into classification of genocide because in that sense, we said prohibiting a group from procreation, which is forced sterilization or imposed abortion or something like that, is one of the elements that was introduced by Raphael Lemkin into the Genocide Convention. So it does touch on that. Symbolization, again, can be positive. Symbolization can be negative, and that is, it depends on the context. And I hate to say that because the presidents of Harvard and MIT and University of Pennsylvania made those words seem sort of peculiar. But having said that, there are positive and negative sides to symbolization. Question always becomes whether it's an imposed symbolization or a chosen symbolization. And those of you who know the Holocaust know that the first response of Robert Welsh, who was the editor of the German Jewish newspaper, when the yellow star was used as a pejorative, was to turn it around and say it, wear it with pride, that yellow star, which is that choose to accord the symbol the values that you have. To Bobby's question, children of God, if God doesn't make as a concept, then the idea that all people are created equal or we're all human beings, and I celebrate the diversity of our collective humanity, all of that is enormously a way of educating to be able to create a common reality and underlying reality for it. Let's go to the next element, which is number 3, discrimination. A dominant group uses law, custom, political power to deny the rights of other group. The powerless group may not be given full civil rights or even citizenship. So, for example, when we had in the United States up until 1964 on water fountains and public restrooms, whites only, that becomes a form of legal discrimination. Prior to that, when we had the idea that certain properties may not be sold to Jews or blacks and the like, that also became a form of discrimination. The notion that there are certain things that certain places and beings that you cannot do, a powerless group is not given full civil rights or citizenship. We understand that's discrimination. Now, again, not every form of discrimination leads to genocide, but every genocide is a result of forms of discrimination, and we have to understand that. Prevention against genocide means full political empowerment and citizen rights for all groups in a society. Discrimination on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion should be outlawed. Individuals should have the right to sue the state, corporations, individuals, and other individuals if their rights are violated. But again, there is also deep discrimination in virtually every society between citizens and non-citizens, as citizens have certain rights and non-citizens do not have precisely the same rights. But again, if you go to something that is deeper as a unifying position, then you can get beyond discrimination. And we have made in our society very significant moves to limit discrimination. If you begin to take the long view of what's happened in the last half century, whether they're adequate, whether they're full, whether they're complete, that's a different story, but they are, again, part of what can prevent genocide. Number 4 becomes enormously important. Dehumanization is when one group treats another group as second-class citizens or as second-class human beings, or even worse than that, non-human beings not entitled to the respect of human beings. Members of persecuted group can be compared with animals, parasites, insects, diseases. When a group of people is thought as less than human, it's easier for a group in control to murder them. And in reality, for those of you who know it, think of the film The Eternal Jew, which was a deep propaganda film promulgated by the Nazis to compare the Jews to vermin or rats. And consequently, we're going to see later that the term that they used for the murder of Jews was extermination. And extermination becomes, again, I had a problem with insects and cockroaches. I called it an exterminator. I don't feel that that's morally reprehensible, but treating a human being as vermin, treating a human being as less than human, and that can start with words, it can then lead to action, and it is deeply and deeply problematic. And again, we all use, states use, societies use terms that dehumanize and call people in dehumanizing terms. And part of that, again, it doesn't automatically lead to genocide, but it certainly is conducive to the atmosphere that allows genocide to take place. Chuck asks, are the 10 stages of genocide used to adjudicate charges of genocide in the International Court of Justice? Not at this point. And part of what the thinking is, the more we articulate what constitutes genocide, creates an early warning system, it creates a way in which we understand, it creates an element of measure, but they are not international law and they are not yet legal categories. They certainly are categories that we should pay attention to for deep sensitivity with regard to how groups turn against groups and put themselves in a position to commit genocide. Let's use an example. Even linguistically, the only good engine is a dead engine, which was said in the American West, and where discrimination and ultimately murder of Indians was commonplace and accepting. At this stage, hate propaganda in print, hate radio is used to make the victims seem like villains. In fighting dehumanization, one must remember there's no right of freedom of speech to tell people to commit murder. That, by the way, is what we call incitement to violence. Outlawing hate speech can save the lives of those targeted. If a country is on the verge of committing genocide, it's no longer a democracy, if it was before. And broad freedom of speech, which is protected in democracy, may need be limited in such a country. Hate radio and hate radio stations should be shut down, hate propaganda banned, hate crimes and atrocity should be promptly punished. This is Stanton. And again, I want you to understand the tension between freedom of speech and what Stanton is proposing. And I want you to understand that we live in societies, and again, hate radio is interesting. There was an offshore radio station in Poland that was used to dehumanize Jews. The reason it was offshore is because it might have been illegal in Poland. We understand with podcasts and broadcasts and everything else, you can have every level of hate being expressed. And we have special categories in the law to protect against dehumanization, which is what we call hate crimes, which have an additional measure of making them anathema and more deeply punished by the law. And sometimes there are mistakes made in this. Go back to the interesting case of what happened in Colleyville when they took the Shabbat morning services at a synagogue, and they essentially took those Jews hostage. The first response of the FBI was this was not a hate crime and it wasn't anti-Semitic, because he regarded it as an act of terrorism, and regarding it as an act of terrorism led him to assume that it had one category and not another. It clearly was a hate crime. It clearly was anti-Semitic. And it also was based on an anti-Semitic propaganda notion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that Jews have a secret society that controls the world. And who did he want to see? He wanted to speak to the rabbi of Central Synagogue. He did not understand that Central Synagogue was called Central Synagogue because it's in the vicinity of Grand Central Station. And he thought Central Synagogue was a code word for the center of Jewish power and the Protocols of Elders of Zion. And he was surprised to learn that the rabbi of Central Synagogue was not a white male, but an Asian American female, which again broke his sense of who controls and who works and who deals with it. So we see the tension between freedom of speech and the tension between freedom of expression and what Stanton is suggesting with regard to preventing dehumanization. Let's go to the next element, which is organization. Genocide is always organized, usually by the state or informally by, sometimes informally by terrorist groups. Special army units, militias are often trained in arms. Plans are made for genocidal killings. We saw that meticulously prepared with regard to the Holocaust. And one has to look at Roald Hilberg's magisterial book, 3-volume book, The Destruction of the European Jews, to see the nature of the organization that is involved, the revolving authorities. But again, the Germans did not act alone. They employed a whole range of militia groups. So, for example, the murders, what was called the Holocaust by bullets, was done not only by Germans, but in Lithuania, 2/3 of the Jews who were killed by Lithuanians. In Latvia, 60% of the Jews were killed by Latvians, and in Estonia, 100% of the Jews were killed by Estonians. So it took an organization not only of the state, but also organized anti-Semitic militia who made plans for genocidal killing. The reason he's also saying this is because you had the unique case, and we'll speak about that next time, of Rwanda, where the genocide in Rwanda occurred over a 100-day period. And there are those who say, and I don't quite accept the figures, I do deeply know about the nature of the genocide because I was one of the people who went to Rwanda right after the genocide to help the Rwandese to protect the evidence of the genocide, and saw mass graves of 25,000 people or more involved. So I have no doubt with regard to genocide. I'm just a little bit skeptical of the full numbers. The claim is that 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. And the mode of killing was a machete, and a machete meant it had to be direct and the like. But what Stanton is arguing, and he's correct in arguing this did not happen spontaneously, and it did not happen with deep planning in advance, and with a way of understanding precisely how it would take place. And consequently, he's arguing in a very deep way that we have to look at the organization that is involved in that. Combat this stage membership in these militias should be outlawed. Their leaders should be outlawed to travel outside the country, where they may be able to raise funds or get weapons. The UN should enforce arms embargo. Government and citizens of countries involved in genocidal massacres, and create commissions to investigate violations, as was done in post-genocide Rwanda. So remember, organization is part and parcel and indispensable to the commission of genocide. The next stage of genocide, and again, I think that one has to see that they don't happen in stages. They often happen simultaneously, and they often happen, I was about to say, they happen simultaneously, they happen at the same time, which is a little bit redundant, but they also can happen in different different elements of the stages. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's that it goes there. Polarization, extremist drives groups apart, hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. Laws may forbid intermarriage or social interaction. And again, he has in mind the Holocaust in particular. And the Holocaust in particular, what? Forbade intermarriage. Jews and Aryans could not marry except if they were married before the law went into effect. Social interaction means discrimination in a range of things. They can't meet in X, they can't go to Y, they can't inhabit restaurants, theaters, etc., etc. Extremist terrorism targets moderates, intimidating and silencing the center. I think this is absolutely pivotal for us to understand that polarization means that there are elements on the right, on the left, one side or the other, and what happens is the center collapses, the center remains silent, the center remains intimidated, and the center remains weak. One of the geniuses of American society in the mid-20th century was precisely that we avoided polarization and we had a good deal of commonality. In Germany, if you look at 1919 to 1933, what you had is polarization. The right had its adherents, the left had their adherents, and the center itself, the moderate center itself, collapsed, was weakened, did not have representation, and the like. Prevention may mean security protection for moderate leaders, assistance to human rights groups, assets, money, and property of extremists may be seized. Again, he's looking to prevent genocide, not giving us an easy way to deal with it. Opportunities for international travel denied to them. If extremists try to take the government, then international sanctions should be put in place. Let me spend a moment looking at a couple of the questions and make sure that we have responded to them as well. People are now more readily willing to consider what was done to Native Americans as genocide. What was done to Native Americans had two forms of had two forms of genocide. One was an organized, systematic genocide, and the other was an inadvertent genocide, because one of the things that destroyed Native populations, not only in the United States, but in a number of other places, one of the things that destroyed Native American populations was disease, because they had not developed the antibodies to diseases that were introduced by Western Europeans, and consequently a whole range of diseases took place that led to a very significant death rate among Native American populations. Slavery is not genocide. But having said that, let's remember that there are other forms of dehumanization, destruction, misery, and behavior. There are other forms of miserable, immoral, anti-moral behavior that are other things than genocide. genocide is not an all-encompassing crime. It's a unique and distinct crime. It by now has become one of the ultimate crimes because of the nature of its being outlawed internationally, and also because of its being associated with the evil perpetrated by the Nazis, but it's not the only form of evil. So to say for a moment, if I say it, that slavery was not genocide, is not to say that slavery was anything less than abhorrent, immoral, destructive, etc., etc., etc. It's not to condone it, to tolerate it, to find it acceptable. It's to say it was a whole range of other crimes, but not the genocidal crime. And I want that to be understood. Whereas the question, can Fox News be compared to Der Stürmer and others like it? We have a problem when any news station, and I don't want to get into the politics of Fox News, when any news station becomes a vehicle for venom and hatred. Leave it to others to judge what Fox is and is not. But again, the power that results in the broadcast is something that we have to consider. In Germany, you had, again, a monopoly on the dissemination of information, and consequently, it had a long I lost my, you forgive me, I lost my trend of thought because I was trying to handle the questions at this point. We've been asked, it looks to me like some of these categories overlap, for example, classification and polarization. That's a very acceptable and very important point. One of the things that Stanton did originally is he had 8 stages of genocide, then he moved to 10 stages of genocide, again, to sharpen his articulation of what each stage represented. But again, classification, polarization, symbolization, discrimination, you can have elements of each of those replete in a genocidal element. Was the Trail of Tears inadvertent genocide or collateral damage? We can answer Jacqueline by saying it depends where, when, and how. It may have very easily been considered both. Polarization means security protection for moderate leaders, assistance to human rights groups. Assets may be seized, opportunities for international travel denied to them. Extremists try to take over the government, then international sanctions should be put in place. Let's look at the next stage, and this is preparation. National or perpetrator groups plan the final solution. Jewish, Armenian, Tutsi, or other target groups question. They often use euphemisms to cloak their intentions, such as referring to the group goals as ethnic cleansing, purification, or counterterrorism. They build armies, buy weapons, train their troops and militias. They indoctrinate the populace with fears of the victim group. Leaders often claim if they don't kill them, they will kill us. Prevention of preparation may include arms embargoes and commissions to enforce them. Should include prosecution, incitement, conspiracy to commit genocide. Both are crimes under Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Again, this does not happen spontaneously. It happens with preparation. We can see preparation taking place as genocide occurs. And then in preceding genocide. Persecution victims are identified, separated out because of ethnic religious identity. Death lists are drawn up. In state-sponsored genocide, members of the victim group may be forced to wear identifying symbols. That's symbolization. Property is often confiscated. That means that genocide is often a crime that is also, the Holocaust was a crime of murder, but also was an enormous crime of theft. Sometimes they're even segregated into ghettos, deported into concentration camps, confined to famine-struck regions, starved. Genocidal massacres begin. This is persecution, which comes to the next stage, which is extermination. Now, I want to say that extermination is what the perpetrators call it. When I'm not using Nazi speak, or not using the speak of the Turks and the Armenian element and the like, I use the term annihilation. But extermination becomes mass killing, and extermination is justified by even its term. They do not believe their victims to be fully human. They believe them to be vermin. When it's sponsored by the state, the armed forces often work with militias to do the killing. In the German case, you had the SS working with the Wehrmacht, working with a whole range of militias, working with a whole range of anti-Semites, etc., all the way through. At this stage, only rapid and overwhelming armed intervention can stop genocide. And this is one of the reasons why we do not have armed intervention to deal with genocide, because it demands war. And in fact, in Yugoslavia, as we will see, there was a deliberate attempt to use any word imaginable, but not the G word, not the genocidal word, because that demands armed intervention. Real safe areas or refugee escape regions should be established with heavily armed international protection. The UN needs troops that can go into genocidal areas and stop the killing when the UN Security Council calls it. The UN may decide to act through regional military forces from organizations like NATO. Relief groups should be prepared to assist the victims. If the UN will not get involved directly, military powerful nations should provide the airlift, equipment, financial means necessary for regional states to intervene with UN authorization. That's the measure of prevention. We'll look at the Yugoslavia case next time so that we understand what happened. In that case, there included bombing and direct United States intervention. And I want to touch on the last stage, and then we're going to take the questions and try to wrap it up within the next 7 minutes, so we're moving very quickly. The final stage of genocide is denial. Denial is the 10th stage that always follows genocide. I would disagree with Stanton. It's not only that it follows genocide, it also is part and parcel of the denial that takes place during the genocide. It is almost among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. Perpetrators of genocide dig up the mass graves, burn the body, try to cover up the evidence, intimidate the witnesses, deny they committed any crimes, and often blame what happened on the victims. They block the investigation of crimes and continue to govern until driven from power by force when they flee into exile. Leaders of genocide continue to deny the crime unless they're captured, and the tribunal special court established to try them. Best response to denial is punishment by an international tribunal or national court. There's evidence that can be heard that the perpetrators punished. Tribunal international courts must be created. They may not prevent the worst genocide killers, but at least some mass murderers may be brought to justice. And he said this text was edited for use by others than legal scholars. Let me also say that one other element is involved in this, which is that denial was used as a means to hide from the perpetrators what they were doing. The German language developed a whole range of euphemisms for what was being done. Final solution to the Jewish question is one, taking executive measures is another. A whole range of languages protect the perpetrator from understanding what they are doing and facing what they are doing. And that's part, and denial, the clear case of denial is not only Holocaust denial, but the ongoing efforts of the Turkish government over generations, even though it is not a government of continuity from those who perpetrated the massacre of the Armenians, the murder of the Armenians, the denial of genocide. And denial is, again, a modality of repetition and almost a desire to repetition. Let me then stop our screen sharing and handle, in the very brief amount of time we have left, the questions. Whatever we can handle today, we will pick up and handle next time. Rebecca asks a question: what characteristics of genocide did treatments of Black in America lack? I would argue with that in a very basic way, that there was a great difference between genocide and slavery. The slave was considered a capital investment. And the best way we see the slave being a capital investment is to think of the slave. There were slave markets. You sold slaves. They were regarded as useful, and because they were regarded as useful, they were not to be murdered. They were to be kept alive until they were no longer useful. Then they could be killed. They also were allowed to procreate, even though the family was destroyed. And procreation, let me put to you this way: if my Kia could back up to your Volkswagen and produce a Chevrolet every night, then that's what they would be doing back to back. The difference in slavery is you regard the slave as having a financial value and not discardable. And consequently, there are a whole range of repugnant, awful, horrific, terrible, miserable, immoral, inappropriate, absolutely destructive measures that are taken against the slave. But the crime of slavery is not genocide. And the best evidence of that is the vast increase in population of Africans in the United States amidst slavery, not because of the benevolence of their slave masters, but because they were considered of value and something to be traded. Let's give a second example. What happens in the moment when your car stops working? You have a choice of repairing your car. That is the equivalent of offering medical treatment to a slave. You have the choice of selling your car, which is to say, I no longer need it because I want a more powerful slave, and somebody else who has less financial resources will accept the less powerful slave. Or you can junk the car, which is again what many masters did, is letting out their slaves to die without medical treatment and without any consideration. What is the difference between classification and slide 8, persecution? Again, we can classify without persecuting. We in the United States ask our census to classify a whole range of people by race, by ethnicity. We can't do by religion because of freedom of religion. Once we classify, that does not mean we persecute. Classification may be fully legitimate and fully appropriate without it leading to persecution. Carol says, and I'm going to just say, I believe that former President Trump used the term vermin in referring to immigrants. Are you correct? Yes, you are correct in referring to immigrants, legal, illegal, etc., as vermin is an inappropriate action and one that has been widely condemned and should be widely condemned along the political sphere. It is one of the elements that, again, can lead, not necessarily can lead to this type of genocidal behavior. Can it be constituted that Hamas is perpetrating genocide against their own people by virtue of Hamas leaders not protecting their people, rather putting them in positions of danger and harm, seeing that Hamas is somehow touching all these definitions? Hamas, again, had a genocidal definition toward all Jews in its original version of the charter. It then cleaned up that and had a definition of genocide toward Israelis. It could have predicted and certainly did predict what Israel's response would be to the events of October 7th. And again, whether indeed what we call, I don't think we can call what's happening to the Palestinians genocide, but I think we can call it horrific, terrible, dehumanizing and horror-filled type of thing. And Hamas certainly knows how that could end and knows how to end it. And again, that's one of the elements there. Let me take one more question and then we'll call it a day, and we'll answer the rest of the questions next week. I'll ask our colleagues to do this. Throughout much of the Arab world, there is propaganda and degradation against Jews and Zionists. Israelis restrictions, job, education, access to practicing Judaism, visitation of Jews and Israelis to these countries, constant dehumanization by articles and political and religious speeches. So is this possibility leading toward a potential genocide of Jews in Israel throughout the world? No one is paying attention to it except Jews and a few others. Many of these countries are member states of the UN, like Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. The language that is being used against Jews in certain speeches and policies and behavior of the Muslim and Arab countries, not all Arab countries, not all Muslim countries. Remember, we have the Abraham Accords, we have peace with Egypt, we have peace with Jordan. Those types of language are clearly potentially genocidal, and consequently, they are deeply and profoundly problematic, as are, for example, the educational material that continues to dehumanize. Let's take the rest of the questions and deal with them next time. I thank you for your attention and have a good week. We meet same time, same place next week. Thank you.